And then I am one of the VITA site coordinators and the trainer, and Miriam Timmer-Hackard is also a VITA site coordinator. We're going to start preparing returns on February 1st. So we have a pretty reasonable runway, but the holidays are sort of in our way. But when you come to the site, if you haven't prepared tax returns before, don't worry. We're going to work in pairs for about the first 2 weeks of our VITA sessions, and that'll give you a way to get more comfortable with preparing tax returns and interacting with the taxpayers. And as soon as you're comfortable doing that, you just tell us and we'll stop working in pairs. The next slide, Rachel.
Okay.
So we have sites at Iowa City Public Library, North Liberty Public Library, and we also have a separate site for international students and scholars. The Iowa City Public Library site and the North Liberty site are where you will primarily work. Those sites are open to all U.S. citizens and green card holders, basically any alien, meaning a non-citizen, who's not a University of Iowa international student or scholar. I forgot to put the word international there. So there are some University of Iowa students and scholars that come to our sites, but those will be either green card holders or U.S. citizens. People on student visas or scholar visas, they come to our special sites that are just for them because their tax returns are generally much different than the tax returns we prepare for citizens and green card holders. So at the Iowa City Public Library, we're going to have sessions on 3 different days. I listed them here for you. Basically, a session is a 3-hour session. You can sign up for one of the sessions, or if you want, you could sign up for both sessions on the same day. You'll have to make sure you eat in the middle, or at least take a little break so you don't, like me, I just sit there the entire 6 hours, and then the end of 6 hours, I wonder why I can't get out of my chair. So you don't want to be like me. We haven't scheduled the sites for the North Liberty Public Library yet, but if we have enough volunteers, we will schedule sites there because there's a lot of interest. And then I mentioned the international students and scholars. We do those returns in the old Capitol Center. Most of you probably won't work with the students and scholars, but if you're interested in learning about non-resident tax returns, let me know because we can always use the help there too. Next slide, Rachel. So what I'm going to try to accomplish in this meeting is just give you a brief overview of the way our VITA sites work. And then I will talk mostly about how you get certified. So basically what the certification site is, what the training materials are that you have access to. I'm going to talk a little bit about the intake sheet because we need to all be using the same procedures with the intake sheet, which I'll describe in a couple minutes. But we need to have common procedures so we all understand what information is being recorded. And I'll talk about that now tonight so that you can use that when you're in your certification training. I'm also going to talk just a little bit about what to know versus what to look up. If you are a new volunteer, you're going to see there's a lot of material. And every single one of our taxpayers is different, but you don't have to memorize the entire tax code to be a VITA volunteer. There are a few things that you'll want to know because they're common across all taxpayers, like filing status and dependents. And then there are other things where you will just look it up. And many times you won't even need to look it up. You just need to be aware that a certain credit exists or certain rules exist, and the software will do the heavy lifting for you. And then I will talk about next steps, like what do you have to do next to get certified? What do you have to do to sign up for sessions? And we'll take some time at the end to set up passwords to 2 resources that you'll need to get certified. And then I will answer any other questions you have. And I should say at this point, I'm a pretty fast talker, but if you have a question, don't wait till the end. Just either put a note in the chat, or I guess there's a way to raise your hand, but I don't know how to do that in Teams, Rachel. But Rachel will monitor the chat. Or I think you can probably just turn on your microphone and start talking. That probably even works the best. Okay. So with that, we're going to jump in. So VITA, just in case you're curious, stands for Volunteer Income Tax Assistance. It's a program that started in the 70s by the IRS, but actually by a professor at the University of California, one of the California schools, who realized he had a lot of very competent accounting students and a lot of people who needed tax returns prepared. And so we worked with the IRS to set up the VITA program, and it spread nationwide really quickly. We've been doing VITA in Iowa City since the 70s, but our program was sort of small scale back then, mostly limited to university students. And we've in the last 10 or 15 years really expanded it to cover lots and lots of taxpayers in Johnson County. There are two different ways that taxpayers can have their returns done through the VITA program. One is the traditional VITA program, where taxpayers come to our site, a volunteer sits with the taxpayer, interviews them, prepares their tax return, and then we e-file it for them. The other method we use is called facilitated self-assistance. I still haven't figured out how the IRS picked that particular name for it, but what it means is that the taxpayer is going to use free IRS provided software to do their own returns. And if they have any questions, they can ask us, and they can e-file their own returns. Most of the taxpayers, and there are, last year, I think we had several hundred that used that method. They never even ask us any questions. The software is pretty user friendly, and they just go through and do their own returns. So like I mentioned, our Iowa City Public Library and North Liberty sites are going to do both. We have a traditional VITA program. That's where you'll be volunteering. And occasionally you'll interact with a taxpayer that walks in to ask a question so that they can finish their own return. The sessions that we do for the international students are all facilitated self-assistance. We help the international students do their own tax returns. And we do, I think we did over 400 returns through that program last year. Next slide, please. So the traditional VITA process, I've tried to draw a picture of it for you. The area that's inside that blue dotted line is supposed to be our Iowa City Public Library site or our North Liberty site. So a taxpayer will walk into our site and they'll have with them tax documents and an intake form, maybe completed. They'll immediately talk to the greeter, who makes sure they have an appointment. Our sites we're running now by appointment, and the taxpayers seem to really like that, and it worked out pretty well for us last year, so we're going to do it again that way. So the greeter confirms the appointment. They give the taxpayer the IRS official intake sheet if the taxpayer hasn't already completed it. And then after the taxpayer has completed that form, they're going to match the taxpayer with a preparer. As a preparer, you're going to take a minute to review the intake sheet, and then you'll start reviewing the information on there with the taxpayer. And as you're interviewing the taxpayer, you're going to mark up the intake sheet, and we're going to use, all of us, the same procedures for doing that, so that it's easy for one person to pick up the work of a different person if the taxpayer has to come back, or it's easy for the reviewer to understand what you meant when you marked up that intake sheet. After you do the interview and the intake sheet's marked up, you're ready to use the software, and you'll prepare the federal and the state returns in the software. We use a version of TaxSlayer, which you'll get to practice with. If you're going to be a preparer, there's something called Practice Lab which is a practice version of the software. And then after you've prepared the return, you'll briefly go over it with the taxpayer, sort of not in detail, but explaining what's in there, and say things like, I've wages listed as your only source of income. Is that correct? It's another way to verify that what they wrote on the intake sheet is correct. Sometimes, and I want to say often because it feels like often, after you finish that tax return and you say, here's your only source of income, the taxpayer will say, oh, yeah, I got this letter from my bank that says I got interest. Is that important? And you say, yes. Let me put that in there. Okay, but so after you have the return finished and you think it's complete, you're going to ask the taxpayer to sit in our review area. So it's like a waiting area for a reviewer. And the next open reviewer is going to review that tax return with the taxpayer and then confirm whatever the next step is for the taxpayer. They'll either say, your return's ready to file and we'll get that filed for you tonight or tomorrow, or they'll say, oh, you need to bring in your social security card in order for us to verify it and file your tax return. But we have a form that the reviewer will fill out to tell the taxpayer what they have to do next. And then the taxpayer leaves either with the completed and e-filed return, or they leave with instructions about what they have to do, either email us, come back, and so forth. Next slide, Rachel. So I'm going to talk about the intake sheet more in depth, but I'm going to talk about it right now too, because it's a major part of what we do. And you'll see in the training, the IRS requires us to have every single taxpayer fill out this intake sheet. The IRS provides it. It's 5 pages this year, but the taxpayer has to fill it out and we have to review it. And it actually does help you prepare a more accurate tax return. It's a pain in the neck at first, but it does give you a good checklist of what needs to be on the tax return, and it shows you where you're going to need to make some decisions about filing status and so forth. So if you did VITA last year, you're going to see that this intake form is a lot different than last year's intake form. They did a major revision on it. It contains the same information, just in a different format. Like basically they gave the taxpayer more information, more room to write, and they give you more room to write. And I think it's a little bit clearer. So it's 5 pages long, like I mentioned. The first page is the taxpayer demographics. So it's like their name, their address, what their marital status is, and whether they have people that might be dependents. So the form actually asks them, list everybody who lives with you or you support. So those are the potential dependents. And when we're reviewing information with the taxpayer, we'll gather enough information so we can determine whether those people actually are dependents. Once we know that, then we can go back and determine filing status. Okay. The second and third pages list income, expenses, and other life events that could affect the tax return. A life event, for instance, is, do you have marketplace insurance? That would mean that there's some settling up to do about that marketplace insurance on the tax return. Or did you get a loan from the government to help buy a house? You know, so things like that are in the life events section. And I put a little picture here of a little clip from the first page of page 2 of the section where it's starting to collect information about income. And you can see the form is designed so that the taxpayer fills out information on the left-hand side, and then the whole right-hand side, that gray area, is for you to take notes when you're interviewing the taxpayer. And then pages 4 and 5 in the intake sheet is basically an optional survey, is on page 4. We encourage the taxpayers to fill it out because the IRS asks us for that information, but it is voluntary on the part of the taxpayer. And page 5 is just a bunch of space that you can write extra things if you didn't have room to write them other places in the intake sheet. And I'm pretty sure I've said this several times now, but it's important. We're all going to use the same conventions for recording information. And I'm tonight going to tell you what they are, and I'll remind you again if you come to other training. Because it's easier, I think, to start out right away using those conventions than have your own convention that you used while you're doing certification, and then suddenly you need to start using a different convention. So we'll talk about those more towards the end of this presentation. Next slide, Rachel. The other process, the facilitated self-assistance VITA process, is pretty simple, and we're not really involved in it much. The taxpayer comes to the Johnson County website, and there will be links on the Johnson County website that lead them to free software that the IRS has contracted for. Last year, we used Online Taxes and Tax Act. I think there might be 4 options this year. But the IRS usually waits until after the filing season starts to actually tell us what those options are. The taxpayer can use which free filing software they want. And their goal is to complete and e-file their own return. Rarely they have questions for us, and they'll walk into the VITA site, or they might even email us. So if they email us, I'll be the one that's answering the questions. But if they walk into the site and you're not working with a taxpayer at the time, we might give you the taxpayer that has the question, and you'll just help them figure out what the answer to their question is. Sometimes it's a tax-related question, but not always. Sometimes they just need a little help figuring out, where do they enter a dependent in the software. So they might show you the software. It's not the software that we use at our site, so it's not TaxSlayer. But really, once you look at one of these tax preparation softwares, they're all pretty much the same. Like there's a place where you enter dependents. You just have to sort of read to see where it is. Okay, next slide. So certification. The IRS does not allow anyone to work at the VITA site who's not certified at some level. So even if you plan to be a greeter, so a greeter, like I mentioned before, is the first place that, the first face that our taxpayers see. So our greeters are really the face of VITA. They make our site run smoothly. So if you choose to be a greeter, it's a really important role. You don't need to be certified in tax law to be a greeter, but you do need to have some certification to be a greeter. So the deadline for certification, and it's a soft deadline, January 15th. It's a soft deadline, but you can't sign up for sessions until after you're certified. So aim for being certified on January 15th, because we're going to try to open signups for taxpayers on January 17th. So the sooner you can tell us when you can work shifts, the sooner we'll be able to figure out how many taxpayers are allowed to make appointments for particular sessions. So there are 2 certifications that are required for everybody. The first is Standards of Conduct Ethics. And you'll see it's pretty common sense. Like, we're volunteers. We are not allowed to take money from the taxpayers. So the IRS wants you to understand, taxpayer tries to give you $20, you have to say, this is a volunteer program. We're not permitted to take your money. Thank you so much for appreciating what we're doing, but we're not allowed to take your money. Sometimes they'll say, well, what can I do? They can buy us cookies. They are allowed to do that, but we can't take money. You can't use the taxpayer's information for other things. Like if you happen to sell insurance, you can't get phone numbers from the VITA information and call those taxpayers up to ask if they need insurance. So common sense things in ethics. So you can't deposit the taxpayer's refund in your bank account. So things that I'm sure you know are logical. And the second certification is called Intake, Interview, and Quality Review. It's basically an overview of how the process works so that even if you're a greeter, you can explain to the taxpayer, you're going to fill out these forms, you're going to work with a preparer, and then we're going to review your return while you're here because the IRS requires us to do that. Okay. And then if you decide that you want to be a preparer, we're asking everybody to get 2 additional certifications, basic and advanced. So basic prepares you to do returns for wage earners and figure out who are dependents and what kind of credits might be on the returns. It's very helpful at our sites to have advanced certification because a lot of our taxpayers have some kind of self-employment income these days. Like they're babysitting, they're driving Uber or Lyft, they're doing DoorDash. So we ask that you get, or if they don't have self-employment, they might have marketplace insurance. A few of our taxpayers have investments, but getting basic and advanced means that you'll be able to help any taxpayer who walks through our doors. It is possible, at least it was possible last year, and I believe it's still possible this year, to get the advanced certification without getting basic certification, but I am asking you not to do that. Do the basic certification first. It will assure you that you know the basic content that you'll see on most returns. And after you pass the basic certification, then pass the advanced. That's exactly what I did too, by the way. Oh, I just clicked my mouse to go to the next slide, Rachel. So thank you.
I got you, Joyce.
Like, why isn't that working? Okay, so the certification tests are online, and I wrote the name of the link. The links in this that I'm showing you now are hot links, but I don't know if you can actually click on those. But I've also got the links all listed at the end of the presentation, so you could just type them in. But anyway, there's an online certification test. You have to get a score of 80 and you have to work alone. So you can't like take the test as a team because you're not going to be doing tax returns as a team. So you need the minimum passing score of 80%. And you only get 2 tries to do it, but it will be, especially for people who are students right now, it will be the easiest test you've taken in a long time because it's open book, open note, open internet. The only thing you're not allowed to do is sit with another volunteer and take the test together. Okay, after you take the test, you are going to get feedback. It comes back and it tells you, oh, your score is 90%. And then you can click through each question to see if you got it correct or not. It'll either say correct or incorrect. It doesn't tell you the right answer, though. But you do get feedback about what's wrong. And you're going to know all the test questions in advance. So publication 6744 contains all the test questions. It's available online. If you want a paper copy, I believe Johnson County is making paper copies of that publication 6744 available, right, Rachel?
Yes, after tonight's session, we'll send out all of the information on where to pick up the paper documents if you're wanting that.
Oh, okay. And hey, Rachel, in that email, I'll send you a list of all the links that are in here so you can email them out.
Excellent.
Okay. So publication 6744, it's called Test Retest, and it lists every question on the test. On the basic test, I'm not sure whether there were 35 or 40 or 45 questions, something in that range of questions, but they're all listed all written in publication 6744, the test retest book. And there's 2 forms of each question. So question 1 might say, this person is married and they want to file a joint return. What's the best filing status for them to use? A, B, C, or D? And another version of the question might just say, what's the best filing status for them to use? And you have to type out the name. So it's just 2 different ways of asking the same question. And you'll see in my recommended process, I suggest that when you're answering the questions, answer the test and the retest version, because sometimes the IRS is not really good at writing a question. But if you look at that, or you might be a little confused about what they mean. If you look at the test version and the retest version of the question, you'll catch some mistakes that you're making, or it will clarify what the IRS is asking about. Okay, so the recommended process to take this online certification test, and this is a method I've been using for years, so I know it at least works well for me, and I've heard that it works well for other people. It's first, you're going to have to choose what way you want to train. So we're going to have online presentations that you can attend for training. I'm going to make those also available that you could download them or stream them, however our website works. The IRS has something called Link and Learn. The IRS also has a publication, like a paper version of all the things you need to know. So you're going to choose which method you want to use, and just do some training beforehand. So either go through the Link and Learn, attend the presentations, read what's in the big book, and then complete the paper version of the test and the retest. So when I do it, I go through question 1 and answer test retest. Go through question 2, answer the test and retest version. So 1 question at a time, the test and the retest version. And then after you complete that test, log in to the certification site and just enter your answers. The questions at the certification test site are identical to the questions in that publication 6744. And after you submit your answers and you find out your score, record the errors that you made in the paper version of the test so you can go back and research what the correct answers were. Most of the time, you won't have to retake that test. You will have gotten better than an 80%. But if you did get less than an 80%, you'll be able to figure out where your errors were. If you got more than an 80%, you still want to figure out where your errors were because you want to prepare accurate tax returns. And again, I'll remind you, if you're going to be a preparer, complete basic first and then go on to complete advanced. It will give you more confidence about your tax knowledge. It gets you used to how the IRS is asking questions, right? So it basically gives you better preparation for preparing returns. Next slide. So when you get the test retest book, you're going to see there's a giant index in the front of it. It doesn't look exactly like what I've written here, but it has this content. So the 2 certifications that everybody has to take, again, are volunteer standards of conduct and the intake, interview, and quality review process. Those 2. Then there's a separate publication for each of those, short publication for each of those to help you. And then if you're going to prepare the returns, you're going to do the basic test followed by the advanced test. Okay, next slide. So the training materials that you'll use, I have listed here, and Rachel will put them in the email that she's sending you so that you have the links. They're pretty easy to read. The ethics and intake, interview, quality review, pretty straightforward. Everything's pretty straightforward. If you want to train in the tax rules, I mentioned there's 4 different ways to do that. Excuse me, 3 different ways to do that. One is our training, which will be live, and also some videos. The Link and Learn, which is interactive, meaning you'll go through some material and then it'll ask you a question so that you can test your own knowledge. Or there's publication 4491, a giant training guide. And there's I link this linklearncertification.com. There's a site that's like the springboard to get to the certification site that will also contain all these publications, but it just tells you their numbers, not what they're about. So it's a little cryptic right now. Next slide, please. So the other resources that you'll use, there's Practice Lab, which I mentioned a little while ago. Practice Lab is the practice version of the TaxSlayer software that we're going to use. Right now, it has the federal return only. When we're actually preparing returns, we'll be able to prepare the federal and the state returns for any state. And eventually, Practice Lab will contain state returns too, but right now it's just the federal return. And you'll use that to create practice returns in the certification tests. There's some questions that are just questions about basic knowledge, like they'll ask you if something's true or false, or they'll ask you maybe what the amount of the standard deduction is for a single person. So just some content questions. And then there's some questions that are scenarios. They describe a taxpayer. They even show you the intake sheet for the taxpayer. And they ask you to prepare a tax return. And to do that, you'll go into the Practice Lab software. Now, to be honest, most of the questions on the certification test, even in the scenarios, you can answer without using tax software. But it's good practice. It'll get you ready to be doing tax returns at the site if you spend a little bit of time getting familiar with TaxSlayer, and the Practice Lab is a great way to do it. One thing to be aware of, both when you're training and when you're doing actual returns, is that the springboard, the page where you get to Practice Lab, also contains the actual software that we're going to use when we're preparing returns. So you want to make sure when you're doing a practice return, you're in Practice Lab, and when you're doing an actual return, you're in TaxSlayer. So you'll see on the springboard page, there's a link. It's like a little icon that says Pro Online. That's the actual software that you would use to prepare a tax return. Practice Lab is the name of the Practice Lab. There's a volunteer resource guide, which you'll use a lot at the VITA sites. And we'll make that available in paper format too. It's not a perfect training material because it doesn't provide any explanation of why things work the way that book is saying they work. And it's a little on the brief side. So it's a good review, but it's not so good at explaining to you why certain things work the way they work. And then, I mean, the be all and end all for reference materials is the tax guide for individuals, which isn't just for VITA, it's for anybody, publication 17. And you may find that that is the easiest way for you to learn information on how to do a tax return. It's pretty dense though, and pretty thick, but that's another resource that you have. Next slide. So when you're going through the training materials, I mentioned, you're going to notice there is a lot to learn. There are just a lot of different issues that our taxpayers face. but there are some common issues that they face. So the common issues are the things that you want to know. And you will know these things after you've helped a couple of taxpayers because you'll see them over and over again. You don't want to have to spend time looking them up, though. If you are ever uncertain about something, look it up. We'd rather be right on the tax return than make our best guess. So we don't want to be guessing. But the things you want to know are things like filing status. So you'll see there's 5 filing statuses. One of them is head of household. It's the most complicated filing status, but we see it quite a bit at our VITA sites. It's basically for unmarried people who have children. Dependents, you'll want to know the rules for dependents, and there's 2 different kinds of dependents. One dependent type is called qualifying child. You'll see the IRS has its own language. So a qualifying child doesn't actually have to be your child. But there's a test. I call it the RASH test because we need to know the person's relationship to the taxpayer, the person's age, whether that person provides more than half their own support, and where that person is living. So those initials RASH make it sort of easy to think about. There's another type of dependent called a qualifying relative. IRS makes it tricky here too because a qualifying relative doesn't have to be your relative. But there are a set of rules, including support, which is defined differently than in qualifying child. And there are relationship and income tests for qualifying relative. So 2 kinds of dependents. You will practice enough that you'll know those rules, or you'll have to maybe look them up briefly, but eventually you'll just sort of know them by heart. You'll also want to know what's included in income, and the rule of thumb is everything, right? So everything is income unless it's a gift from a relative. And then there are some kinds of income that don't have to be reported to the IRS. So on your federal return, if you have tax exempt interest, for instance, that doesn't have to be reported. But you'll want to know what's included in income. You'll want to have a feel for what are the requirements for the earned income credit, the child tax credit, and education credits. These are the 3 largest credits that show up on a person's tax return. The earned income credit can be $6,000, so it's a big credit. Child tax credit can be quite high, as can education credits. So you'll want to know not every tiny detail about those credits, but a rough idea of what qualifies you for the earned income credit. So if it's not showing up on a return, you know whether that's correct, or did a question get answered incorrectly and they should be getting the earned income credit. You'll want to know some information about dates, and the 2 important things about dates. First, if a person is born or died during the year, they're considered alive all year. And second, usually your status on the last day of the year determines your status for the entire tax return. So if you're single all year but get married the end of the year, you're considered married all year. If you are 16 all year and turn 17 on the last day of the year, you're considered 17 years old and you won't qualify your parents for the child tax credit. So dates, those 2 important things about dates, and everything else, you just want to have a feel for what to expect, but not the details. So know, for instance, that there is a child tax credit, and it's for youngest children. It is the one exception to the date rule that I just mentioned. So the child tax credit, whether you get that credit or not, depends on whether you were 13 or not when the expense was being incurred, whether you were under 13 or not when the expense was being incurred. But you want to know the credit exists that it's got some limitations and qualifications, and then you could look the rest up in that publication 4012, that guide that we use at the um, VITA sites. You don't need to remember numbers. So in the certification test, it will ask you, what is the amount of the standard deduction for this taxpayer? But feel free to look that up, because in the software, once you tell the software about the taxpayer's age and their marital status or their filing status, the software is going to determine the standard deduction. You're not going to have to type in a number. So you want to know that there is a standard deduction. You want to know where it shows up on the tax return, but you don't have to memorize all those numbers. Like, keep your brain cells for something important. Okay, next slide, Rachel. So when the taxpayer comes to the site, they're basically going to have two information sources with them. One is that intake sheet. They can get the intake sheet online. They might have already filled it out, or they will be handed it by the greeter. Again, the IRS requires us to review the intake sheet with the taxpayer before they start a return. And that's a really good idea also when you're doing the certification test. So when you encounter a scenario and there's an intake sheet there for the taxpayer, mark it up and act like you're interviewing that taxpayer, even though the taxpayer's responses are the little scenario that the IRS has created for you. But just practice that process of looking at the intake sheet and converting the intake sheet to information that goes in the return. Because the taxpayer fills that intake sheet out, there could be lots of errors on it. You know, the IRS uses ordinary English language to mean things that are very specific to the IRS. Taxpayer doesn't always know that, so they might answer a question incorrectly. Like, there's a question on the intake form that says, did you have marketplace insurance? A lot of taxpayers say, oh yeah, I paid Blue Cross Blue Shield, so I had marketplace insurance. That's not what marketplace insurance means to the IRS. So you want to ask the taxpayer, you know, what kind of insurance did you have? Did you really get it through the insurance marketplace website, or did you get it through a different, for Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, whatever? Okay. You will also add information to the intake sheet. For instance, sometimes taxpayers get interest, but the bank doesn't report it to them because it's low enough that they're not required to report it. It's still income to the taxpayer, so you'll want to record it just like cash interest on the intake sheet. And then you notice I keep saying we're all going to use the same markup conventions, and that's because using the same markup conventions is one of the things that makes the VITA site run smoothly, because you're going to prepare the tax return. You're going to have all that taxpayer information in your head, and then you're going to pass the taxpayer off to a reviewer who has none of that information. So it needs to be on the intake sheet. And the taxpayer will also come with a lot of documents, mostly W-2 forms, 1099s, which are income forms, like there's a 1099 INT for interest, a 1099R for retirement income, all different kinds of 1099s. There are 1098s, which report expenses, like a 1098T reports tuition expense. Plain old 1098 reports mortgage expense or mortgage interest expense. So things that are related to the tax return. And then there are a series of forms called 1095s, 1095A, B, and C. They're all information forms that are related to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Only one of them, 1095A, makes any difference on the tax return these days. That's about marketplace insurance. So if a person has marketplace insurance, we're going to have to make sure we have their 1095-A because we need it to prepare the return. And then the taxpayers will have a bunch of other forms that they don't have any idea whether they're related to the tax return or not. Most of the time, they're not related to the tax return, but they might be. So you'll want to review those forms, anything the taxpayer has with them, just to make sure it's not something that belongs on the tax return. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to spend a couple minutes going over in detail how to mark up the intake sheet. And this information is mostly here so that you can refer back to it when you're working with intake sheets. So the page 1 has the taxpayer's name, address, marital status, and dependents. And the things you're going to mark up on there. Okay, so you're going to review everything on that page and subsequent pages and correct any errors that you find. Or sometimes the taxpayer's handwriting is not super clear. You're going to want to write it out so that it's easy to read. On the first page, the taxpayer is going to list birth dates for the taxpayer and their spouse, and for any dependents that are on the return. We use birth dates over and over again, so it's a good idea to calculate the age and write it. I usually write it and circle it close to the birth date. And that will help you make sense of the tax return when you get it. For instance, the standard deduction changes if the taxpayer is over 65. So if you've calculated the taxpayer's age and you see they're 70, it won't be a surprise to you when you look at the standard deduction and it's not the normal number that you see on the return. Also, credits are related to dependent ages. So calculating the age will help you know whether a credit should appear on the return. In the dependent section of the return, there's a gray area where you answer some additional questions about the dependent that help you determine if they're a qualifying child or a qualifying relative. So you're going to want to make sure that you complete that gray area for each dependent. After you've completed the gray area in the dependent section, you are going to record whether that person is a qualifying child, a QC, or a qualifying relative, a QR. And we're going to write that to the left of the dependent so that you and the reviewer know where to look for that information. So you make a determination. Is it a qualifying child? Is it a qualifying relative? If it is, you write that to the left of the dependent's name. If it's not a dependent, you just strike through it. And in the comment section, write why, or if you have room on the first page, write why they're not a dependent. And a reviewer, when they review, will use that information to help verify what you've done on the return. You'll also have an idea of what qualifies somebody for the earned income credit, the child tax credit, that's CTC, the credit for other dependents, COD. You're going to write what credits they qualify the taxpayer for on the right-hand side of the dependent section. So over to the right of the gray area, you're going to write a little EIC if that dependent qualifies the taxpayer for the earned income credit. You're going to write CTC if that dependent qualifies the taxpayer for the child tax credit, or COD if that person qualifies the taxpayer for the credit for other dependents. And after you finish that dependent section, only then are you able to determine the filing status. So the last thing you'll do is determine the filing status and write it on the right-hand side of the marital status block that's on page 1 of the intake sheet. So since I didn't show you a picture of page 1, that might sound a little cryptic, but we have a handout that will get out to you that shows you how to mark up the intake form. So on that first page, you're going to make a lot of decisions about what the taxpayer's filing status is. Are there dependents on the return? Are there big credits on the return? So that first page is doing a lot of work and sort of shaping what the tax return is going to be, what the tax return looks like. Next slide, Rachel. Okay, pages 2 and 3 of this intake sheet ask about income and expenses and tax-related events. So I put the same little clip up here, a piece of the income section. And you're going to, just like the first page, you're going to review it with the taxpayer. You're going to correct any errors that they've made, because sometimes they might check tips. And it's important to know whether tips were reported on the W-2 or were they just cash that they got that never got reported on the W-2. You're going to, on the right-hand side, if they were on the W-2, you'll write on W-2. If they weren't on the W-2, then you'll write not on the W-2, because that tells you need to do something different in the software. Sometimes, I don't have the questions here, but there are questions where the taxpayer will check something, but they didn't understand exactly what the form was asking about. So you might have to strike through what they wrote to change from, a check means yes, it needs to be on the return. Strike through it if it doesn't exist. Okay, and then on the right-hand side, you're writing comments. And the way the IRS wants us to do this is if the taxpayer puts an X or a check mark in the box, say next to wages here, and they'll say they had 3 jobs, you're going to interview them and ask them how many W-2s did they get, and you'll write that down on the right-hand side. You'll put an X also, or a check mark, in the W-2 box, because yes, there are W-2s, and you've noted how many they are. And the taxpayer might have had 2 jobs for the same company, so they might write 2 for jobs, but you write 1 for W-2 because there's only 1 W-2. And then you want to write a little note like same employer, something like that. So the reviewer would know why, if the taxpayer said they had 2 jobs, you said they only had 1 W-2. Okay. So, and then let's say they did not check the tip box. The IRS is requiring us to make a note that they don't have tips. And I think you want to keep that column of check boxes where something needs to be on the return. You want to keep that pretty clean. So if the taxpayer says they don't have tips, rather than do anything, where that checkbox is, over on the right, write the word no. Or just an N even will be fine, but you need to do something to indicate that that doesn't exist. Last year on the intake form, they had yes and no boxes. This year, they've gotten rid of all the no boxes, so we're going to have to just make a little N, and again, write it to the right-hand side there, so that when you're glancing down the list of what needs to be on the return, the only things that are marked are things that need to be on the return. Okay, next slide, Rachel. Okay, so page 4 is this optional information. The IRS is interested in who's coming to the VITA sites. Quite a few years ago, they used to ask, is English your first language? And if it's not, what language do you prefer? Or what language would you like spoken? And that was very informative because they could create forms in those other languages. Now they've stopped collecting. They have a different way to get that information. And so now they just ask, are you fluent in English? Does anybody have a disability in your household? Things like this. They're trying to figure out in general what kind of taxpayers VITA helps. So again, it's completed by the taxpayer. You don't have to review it with the taxpayer. But if the taxpayer does report something in here, you need to make sure you enter it in the software. And if they haven't written anything in this form, you should say, you know, the IRS requests that we collect information to help them understand who comes to the VITA site. Are you willing to be part of that survey? And if they say yes, then quickly ask these questions so you can get responses that you can later put in the software. But if they say no, it doesn't prevent us from doing their tax return. It doesn't affect them in any way. Next slide. And then the very last page, and I haven't seen these intake sheets, so I don't know how they're connected. The IRS making it sound like it's a three fold out thing, which would mean it has 6 sides, but they tell us it has 5. But at page 5, it just says additional notes, and it's like a whole page of lines, so you can write additional space. Sometimes you'll see your taxpayer writes a little note in here that says, thank you so much. Or, you know, VITA is just so valuable to me. Sometimes they write some really like nice, warm feeling stuff in there. Okay, next slide. So just a brief summary of marking up the intake sheet. Practice when you're doing the certification taxpayers. It's never too soon to start. It'll become automatic. It'll make your life easier at the site. Make sure your markup is legible so that the taxpayer and the reviewer can read it. When the taxpayer is done at our site, we send that intake form home with them with all their other tax materials. If they would ever be audited by the IRS, they need to explain what's in their tax return. So even though we do their tax return for them, they're responsible for all the information on their own return. So they need to know basically what we were thinking when we prepared that return. They need to know what they told us when we prepared the return for them, and that information is all on the intake sheet. So they need to be able to read it, and the reviewer needs to be able to read it so that they can finish the review. You should, in concept, be able to prepare the tax return using just the information in the intake sheet and detail that's on forms that they brought, like the W-2, the 1099s, and 1098s. So you don't have to write every little box of information that's on the W-2 on the intake sheet because they have the W-2. But there shouldn't be anything in the tax return that's not noted on the intake sheet and detail contained on one of those documents. And again, the reviewer has to be able to tell what the return should look like just by looking at the intake sheet. So the intake sheet tells you basically what lines on the return should have information on them. And then the supporting documents like the W-2s and the 1099s tell you amounts that should show up on those lines. So there shouldn't be any surprises on the return. So for instance, if the taxpayer doesn't check that they have self-employment income, there should not be any self-employment income on that return. If there is self-employment income that belongs on the return, make sure it gets noted somewhere in that intake form. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're going pretty fast and nobody has asked any questions, and I think nothing's in the chat. Is that right, Rachel?
Thus far. Sorry, I had a mouse issue. My mouse stopped working, so but no, I haven't seen anything yet. Do we want to pause? Does anyone have anything that they'd like to ask right now?
This is a great time to pause. So if you
So yeah, I got a question.
okay.
So how complicated of a tax return are we able or willing to prepare?
Oh, okay. So when you go through the training is going to tell you what's in scope and not in scope.
Okay.
So I haven't mentioned, and I should mention in case people are concerned, there is an act called the Volunteer Protection Act that as long as you're a volunteer at the VITA site and you're working within the scope of your certification, you can't be held liable for any errors on the tax return.
Okay.
But it's good to worry about scope, because if you did prepare a tax return that was out of scope, that Volunteer Protection Act doesn't protect you anymore.
Okay.
So scope, the kind of returns we do at our sites, there's an income limit that we set, which is pretty high. And I think it's 65,000 this year. It changes a little bit every year. It's basically based on what is the highest income a person could have and still get the earned income credit. Most things that are like common sources of income are in scope. So wages for sure are in scope, interest is in scope, Social Security and pensions are in scope. Crypto transactions are not in scope, and people might have them, and if they do, we cannot do their tax returns. I mentioned a lot of our taxpayers are self-employed. Self-employment income is in scope as long as the expenses are, I think the limit is less than $20,000. And we actually set a lower limit at our site. I think last year we used 10,000, just because of a person self-employed and they have $20,000 in expenses, they probably should be talking to an accountant. I hope so. I haven't mentioned everything that's out of scope, but most common things are in scope. And we do, when the taxpayer comes to our site, we have a form they fill out that lists the most common things they might have that are out of scope, so that we should be screening them before they get to you.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Anything else? Oh, Rachel, it looks like there might be something in the chat.
Okay, for some reason it did not pop up for me. Would it be all right if I stayed behind after 8 to ask a couple of questions? That was Ben.
Oh yeah, that's fine. I don't know about Rachel, but I'll stay till everybody leaves. And I think we'll actually be done with this before 8 too, so people can ask more questions. And I really would rather have you ask questions than be scared away and decide you don't want to do VITA. Because it is daunting when you first look at the training materials. But it definitely not beyond your capabilities. There's just a lot. And if you haven't looked at taxes before, there's a lot of new language. But there are people like at the VITA sites, you're not sat in a corner and forced to do a tax return by yourself. Anytime you have a question, you can ask me, or you can ask another preparer, or you can look in a book. There's all sorts of resources for you. So you should never feel like you're guessing on a tax return. You should always, if you have a question, ask. And we're like super happy to answer the questions. So anything else? Okay, if not, then I'm gonna continue on here and talk about next steps and then help everybody get set up with the passwords that they need. Okay, so next step basically is first, you're going to have to create passwords, at least for the online certification test. If you decide you want to be a greeter, you won't need a password for Practice Lab because Practice Lab is for practicing with the tax software. But, you know, if you're thinking you want to be a greeter, maybe set up that Practice Lab password anyway, and you can take a little look at what the material is, and you might decide you want to also be a preparer. And if you decide you want to be a preparer and you get to the VITA sites and you're like, oh my gosh, this is just too much stress, tell us that you'd rather be a greeter, because like our greeters keep our VITA sites going. So both are really important roles. Okay, so we're going to set up passwords. The next thing you'll need to do is pass the certification test. So you'll have to decide what way you're going to train, and then use that publication 6744 to write your answers down. Now, it's an online certification test, and the questions are right there on the screen. So you don't have to use the paper version of the test. I find it easier because everything's recorded, and if I ever need to go back and look at something, it's right there that I can find it. And I mentioned before, you get 2 tries to pass this test. If you take the test and you don't pass it on your first try, before you try again, email us at vita@johnsoncountyiowa.gov so that we can help you make sure that you pass on the second try. So we'd be happy to review material with you, maybe point you to a resource that you hadn't looked at before, things like that. After you pass the certification tests, you're going to send your completed volunteer agreement to vita@johnsoncountyiowa.gov. And this threw me a little bit for a loop. Make sure you have johnsoncountyiowa.gov, because johnsoncounty.gov goes someplace else. Rachel,
Kansas.
Where?
It goes to Johnson County, Kansas.
Oh, yeah. So Johnson County, Kansas doesn't want your volunteer agreement, but we do. So again, the soft deadline is January 15th. If you can't certify by then, really, it only means you might not be able to sign up for the first couple of VITA sessions. But just, if you can, certify by the 15th. If you can't, certify by whenever it works for you, because you're really valuable to us. The volunteer agreement is in the certification site, and I'll show you that in a minute. So 2 things happened last year, and I've used the certification site, but I haven't checked this one detail. So last year you could print your certifications like a basic, it looked just like a diploma you could hang on the wall. You could print your certification for basic and your certification for advanced and your certification for the intake and interview and quality review. You could print all those. We don't need those. We just need the volunteer agreement. So you don't need to email us individual certificates. You just need to send us the volunteer agreement. And on the next couple of pages, I will show you what that looks like when you go into the certification site. And please just remember, we're here to help you. If you have questions, just email and we'll get back to you. We usually get back to you the same day. Sometime it might take us a day or 2 if there's a lot of people asking questions. But just reach out, because we really love to help people. And we really want you to be a volunteer. Next slide, Rachel. Okay, so after you've been in the certification site and you've passed the certifications that you want to pass, you're going to send us the volunteer agreement, and you're going to click on. So this is what you're looking at, is the main page of the certification site. And I captured this before I was certified in anything. So you can see that it says I have 0 certificates. And as you pass the certifications, that number is going to increase. But to get to the volunteer agreement, you're either going to click on the link that says volunteer agreement in the menu bar, or click on the link that says sign form. I think that's 13.115. I'm not, oh no, that's 13.615, the volunteer agreement. So click on either one of those two links. It takes you to the same place. Next slide. So on the volunteer agreement, when you generate it, it's going to ask you some questions. So the volunteer agreement, before you save the copy for us, make sure it's the latest volunteer agreement. So the way those volunteer agreements work, if you tell the software to produce one and then you pass another certification test, that next certification test isn't in the document that was produced. So you have to tell it to regenerate the certification test, certification document. Okay, when you generate the certification document, it's going to ask you some questions about you, but some of them are about the VITA site that you're working with. So I've included those responses here. So when it asks for your sponsoring partner, that you should type Johnson County, Iowa VITA. That's us. Okay. When it asks for the years that you volunteered, it wants you to include the upcoming year. So if you never volunteered for VITA before in your life, you'll put a 1 here because this is your first year. And then for volunteer position, just choose VITA volunteer. And then you'll check the little checkbox that says you agree to sign the form electronically. And then you'll click on sign the form, and then it'll ask you if you want to download it, and you say yes, and save it to your computer, and then rename it. So we've got to have these volunteer agreements on hand if the IRS ever asks for them. So we need a way maybe to find yours for the IRS. And so we do that by having us all use the same naming convention. So you're going to name it your last name followed by your first name, and then an underscore and the words volunteer agreement. So like mine is named Berg Joyce underscore volunteer agreement. Yours will be your last name, your first name underscore volunteer agreement. Okay. And then check to make sure that the form has the certifications that you passed listed on it. It should if you follow these instructions. And then you're going to email it to vita@johnsoncountyiowa.gov. Okay. Oh, one other thing that I didn't list here. The IRS wants your name as it appears on your government issued ID. So if you go by Steve, but your name is Stephen, make sure on the volunteer agreement you say your name is Stephen, if that's what's on your driver's license. So use the name that's on your driver's license. Next slide. Okay, so there are 2 resources, like I mentioned, that you're going to use in training and certification. These 2 resources require separate logins, but your passwords can be the same. So basically, there are 2 different applications that don't share information between them. They don't even know each other exists. So the first thing you need to set up a password for is the online certification site. And I'm going to step you through how to do that in a minute here. But your login name is going to be your email address. So use the email address that you want to get email at from VITA. And even if you are a volunteer returning, it's a brand new certification site. So your login from last year won't work. You'll have to create a new login. And again, your login name is your email address, and your password will be whatever you pick. Just make sure you write it down. And then for Practice Lab, this is a resource that tax preparers will need to get familiar with the software, to pass the certification tests. When you set up your login for that, pick a username you like, but put _train at the end of it. And the reason we do this is so that you don't accidentally prepare an actual return in the training software or a training return in the actual software. So we're going to have two different passwords for those two pieces of software, two different login IDs. You can have the same password if you want, but two different login IDs. And it's just a backup to make sure you're in the right software when you're using your password with or your username with _train. You're going to be using the training software. When you use just your username, you're going to be in the TaxWise software where we're preparing an actual return. And here, if you had a Practice Lab account last year, you can use the same account. Now, if you had a Practice Lab account last year, but not for our VITA site, you might want to set up a new Practice Lab account because I think it asks you information about the site that you'll be volunteering at. We'll see that in a slide or two here. Okay, so I think most of you haven't created these passwords, and we'll have time to do it, and I'll be able, if you're having trouble, I'll be able to try to troubleshoot with you. Next slide. Okay, so for the online certification test, you're going to go to this lms.linklearncertification.com, and you're going to create an account. So you'll see the screen that I have pictured here. It asks you to log in, but if you don't have an account yet, below that, you click on create your account, and that'll take you to another page where you create your account. So next slide, Rachel. Okay, so there's a couple of pages. The first page, you're going to create your login and your password. Your login, like I mentioned, is going to be your email address. So it's just asking for your email address. Use your name, your first name and last name, like it's on your photo ID. And you can pick whatever password you want. It's got some rules, requirements for the password. Down lower on the same page, it asks you for your phone number. You don't have to put that in there, but you do have to enter your name and address. You can put your phone number in there if you want. I don't put my phone number in things that I don't have to. Next slide. And then the next, after you hit enter on that page, then you'll get some more questions here. How did you train? There's a drop-down list of training methods. Like if you take our training, you'll select other. If you use Lincoln Learn's in the list. Okay. It asks you if you're an instructor, you're going to say no. And it asks you if you're a spec territory manager. That basically means do you work for the IRS with VITA? You're going to say no. And then you're going to click on create your account. Next page, Rachel. And then as soon as you do that, you'll get a confirmation that says, congratulations, you made your account. Please confirm your email address. And you have to confirm your email address before you can use the certification site. So basically it sends email to the email address you gave them, and then you have to say, yes, this is me. And again, I put these slides in here mostly so you can refer back to them. Next slide. Okay. So for Practice Lab, you're going to create a different account. And the one tricky thing about Practice Lab is that TaxSlayer has tried to put a gatekeeper right in the front of the Practice Lab software for everybody. So when you first go to vita.taxslayerpro.com, or if you just Google VITA TaxSlayer, it will take you to the same page. You're going to see there are 3 information boxes across the top of that page, and the left-hand information box says Practice Lab. So you'll want to select the Practice Lab box, and the first thing it does is ask you for a password And that password for everybody is Train Pro Web. Okay, it's all capital letters, all one word, basically Train Pro Web. And you type that in. And after you do, then it says, what's your individual login information? Okay, and if you don't have a login information yet, you're going to click to create an account. Okay, next slide. Okay. Again, when you make your username, and it can be anything you want, like mine, I think is jberg, make sure it says _train after it. So mine for Practice Lab, I'm jberg_train. You'll be whatever login you choose _train to remind you that you're in the training software. You'll pick a password, and it uses the same password rules as the real version of TaxSlayer. So it has to be 15 characters, one uppercase, one lowercase letter, one number, and one special character out of that list that I have listed there for you. For program type, you want to choose VITA. And for site identification number, you're going to type this S260675558. That's our VITA site identification number. So that connects you with our site. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give you some time in a minute to create those things, and I'll sort of hang out here so I can help troubleshoot with you. This next page is just the embedded links that I had in the slide, so you can get to them if you don't have active links on the slides you see. It just lists things that we've already talked about. Next slide. And this is how I know we're done so far. Do you have any other questions before we start creating passwords? And again, just unmute yourself and ask if you have a question. No questions? Okay, well then let's, Rachel, can you go back a couple of slides? Oh, so I see someone asked, will the slides be mailed out? Rachel, you're going to mail a link to the presentation, right?
Yes, so
Yes.
the presentation is recorded. Well, I'll stop the recording here in just a minute, but it'll be recorded. I'll send out all of the links, and we can send out a PDF of the slides.
Yeah.
If that's okay with you, Joyce, we can definitely send
Yeah,
it
and
out for reference.
let's make sure that PDF has active links in it, so they can just
Yep.
click on the things in the PDF and it'll take them to the sites they want to be at.
And I think I'll actually probably upload them to the Johnson County website as well, so people can access it easily there.
Okay. Okay, so what I was going to say, Rachel, was maybe go back to the slide where you set up an account for the certification site and give people a
Okay.
chance to set up their accounts.
Sure, just 1 second, okay.
Uh-huh.
The Lincoln Learn, are you talking about? Or which one are you talking
No.
about specifically?
Oh, so the slide, it's probably like, oh, I don't know how many slides back, but it says passwords. Let me look at my other computer and see if I can see what it says.
Okay.
It's in the section where it's talking about creating passwords, and it's like the certification test. It says link learn certification probably as a link.
Found it, I think. Let me click a couple buttons here. That one?
Yes. So if you want to create an account for the certification site, and again, I just saw the list of people who are here, so I realized there's some people that were volunteers last year. You still have to create an account here. So that link says LMS, stands for Learning Management System, lms.linklearncertification.com.
I'm trying to copy it, but once I'm in presentation mode, it won't let me.
Oh, if you hold down, I think if you hold down the shift and click on it, it might let you open it.
Well, look how genius you are here. I'm just gonna put it in the chat for everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Somebody just asked you to do that, so
I'm trying to.
you're
It's
a magician, you're a mind reader.
I am slow. Let me know if that works.
I see it.
It looks rather odd, but
So if there's anybody that can't get to the certification site, make sure you just ask a question. So I want to make sure you at least have your access set up for these two things that you need.
So if I had an account last year, I'd only need a new account for Practice Lab, right?
If you did VITA last year, you need a new certification login, but your old Practice Lab account should work.
But for the certification login, all the information would be exactly the same.
I don't know what you mean, Ben. So for certification, so last year when you set up your certification login, your login was not your email address. Right, so you have to set up a new, the one thing to worry about, Ben, is make sure you're at the correct web address for the certification.
I mean, I'm logged in and everything. I can take a test.
Oh,
I can discuss it with you at the very end.
okay, let's do that. And then somebody just asks, it asks you select your role. Does it not say VITA volunteer in the list?
Not that I can see. It says select role and then it's got check boxes. Maybe oh, it says selection is optional. Should I select nothing?
Well, also scroll up and down, because when I created my account, let me go back and look at my slide, but what I put on the slide is what I was seeing as I was doing it. So I think when I created my account, it actually had VITA volunteer as an option.
I just sent a picture in the chat showing what we're seeing.
Okay. Let me figure out how to get back to the chat. Okay, let me figure out how to open this chat thing.
Yep.
Oh,
I'm just getting a picture of the image message with a strike through it.
oh, hold on. Oh, select all that apply to you. So yeah, don't check any of them if they're not true. So I apologize. They changed this since I got certified. So you're not any, you all are not any of these things. So just say create an account
Okay.
without checking those.
I got to the end of this and it can't log me in because my email address already exists as an account, user account.
Really? Is this Mike I'm talking to?
Yes, yeah.
I recognize your voice. Try going back to the original page where you tried to create your account
All right,
and say forgot password.
let me try that.
Yeah, so what they told us was that none of the information from old accounts got carried over to this site. It's possible that changed. So I am right now on my other computer logging into the site just to see if I can give you any helpful information. Oops, now I need to figure out what my password was. I have it somewhere, I'm sure. Ben, did you get logged in?
I can be.
So you've got access set up already?
I had previous access to the TCE testing site.
Okay.
Does that need to be for a particular site, or if I get the certification anyway, does it matter?
Well, there'll be some questions. So when you generate your volunteer agreement, just make sure it says Johnson County, Iowa VITA. It should. I think that's, I'm not sure what it said last year for you, so you might need to change that, but you do have the option of changing it. Yeah, so for you, after you get your certifications, it might have saved what was in the system for you last year. And then you just say regenerate the certification and it will ask you who your sponsoring partner is. And that's Johnson County, Iowa VITA.
That would be under organization name?
That would be under, hold on, so you're in the testing site and you clicked on regenerate and sign again.
I'm in the testing site. That's not through profile, I'm guessing.
Well, if you're in the testing site, let me go back to the home page.
I can share my screen if that works
Yeah,
better.
show me what page you're looking at.
Of course. This is what I'm looking at.
2024. Okay, that's right. So under form 13615, click on sign form.
Okay.
Now what are you seeing?
Take certification test.
Oh, you can't sign the form until you take certification tests. Okay, so
Okay.
you haven't taken any certification tests yet. But
is that a
after
thing I should change through my profile?
what? No.
Okay.
After you take a certification test. Oh, wait, maybe you can change it through your profile. Go in there and look. I don't think you have anything that you don't want other people to see, do you?
Personal information, maybe contact info.
No, it's not that. Yeah. Oh, wait, was sponsoring agency? It's really small on the screen I'm looking for. Oh,
I know sponsoring agency is under contact information, and this has site identification number.
oh, that's for continuing education.
Ah.
So you're not trying to get a continuing education thing. So I'll tell you when I see it. After you take some certifications and you're ready to sign that agreement, there's a box that says sponsoring partner name. It's right in the volunteer agreement when you're trying to generate it.
Yeah.
And so for sponsoring partner name, you're going to put Johnson County, Iowa VITA. For
Okay.
you, it might say Tippy College from last year. And you'll want to change.
I think it was blank last I checked.
Oh, okay.
Organization name?
For me, it says sponsoring partner name. I don't know what page you're on anymore. But if it looked like you couldn't generate a volunteer agreement anyway because you haven't certified in anything, have you?
Not yet. I have some of the tests all filled out, so I can go through and do that.
Yeah. So you don't need to worry. And it'll be clear when you go to generate the volunteer agreement, it will say sponsoring partner. That Johnson County, Iowa VITA is the sponsoring partner or the site name.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So let me. Okay, so people have gotten, it looks like people have gotten their logins now for the certification site. Good. I'll have to change my slides before tomorrow to tell people their account might exist. And so I want you to know when I sign up, my account did not exist. So that's something, they must have improved something. Okay, so Rachel?
Yes.
Can you now take us to the slide that has people create their password for Practice Lab?
Yes, let me take a look.
It should be, I don't know, 3 or 4 slides past where you were just now.
Got it. Here, 1 second. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it. Okay. So if you were a volunteer last year, check to make sure that your username from last year, which should include _train, and your password from last year for Practice Lab still work. Otherwise, if you're new, you're going to have to create an account. Oh, and I think Rachel's putting the link in the chat.
Yep, should be in there.
Okay, good. So when you go to that TaxSlayer Pro, make sure that there should be 3. Let me just go. I'm trying to follow along with my other computer here and I'm getting confused with my mice. Hang on a second. Yeah, so when you go to that Tax Slayer Pro site, you should see 3 boxes across the top, and the left-hand one says Practice Lab, and that's where you want to click. The middle box is the software that we're going to actually use at the site, and the right-hand box should be a blog. The last time I tried to use it, it wasn't working. It looks like it's still not working. Eventually, they'll start putting some interesting information in there, but apparently there's nothing interesting yet. Oh, and I mentioned only briefly, but I'll mention again because it might be helpful. When you start using the software, I mean, feel free to just look around. You're not going to hurt anything. On the left-hand side, once you're in the software, there'll be like a menu that will let you hop around different sections of the tax return. But if you want to know about something specific, that publication 4012, which is the publication we use at the site, not only tells you tax rules, but it also tells you how to use things in the software. So if you are trying to figure out whether somebody's a dependent, that publication shows you the rules for determining whether somebody's a dependent, but it also shows you how to enter a dependent in the software. You know, or if you're trying to enter retirement income 1099-R, it will show you, it'll talk a little bit about retirement income, and it will also show you how to enter that in the software. So that publication 4012, it has a lot of information about using the software in addition to tax information. Oh, and I see on this Tax Slayer Pro page, it's got an email address where you can write to Tax Slayer to ask them questions, or it has a phone number to call them. Don't do that for Practice Lab. If you've got a question about Practice Lab, email the Johnson County VITA so that we can help you. Their contacts are really just for people using the online actual software to prepare a tax return.
I got one of those tests completed and I don't see where what you want is. Do you want to use this as a way to show where the...
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so go click on the link that says volunteer agreement in that top menu bar.
Volunteer agreement?
Yeah. Okay, that is not big enough for me to read. Do you see sponsoring? Does it say sponsoring name or something?
Sponsoring partner name / site name.
Okay, that's where you want to type Johnson County, Iowa, VITA.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the rest of the questions you should just be able to answer based on your information.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Joyce, we have a question in the chat from Charlotte. Charlotte says, what is the naming convention for our user ID? User ID _train. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think you're asking what should be the user ID, and I will tell you, in the actual software that we're going to use, I'll be assigning you a username, and it'll be your first initial and your last name. So if you want to use the same thing here and then _train, that would work. But really, you can pick any user ID you want as long as you remember it.
And then we had another question from Frank. What is the site ID number for the Tax Slayer training site?
Oh, okay. So Rachel, if you can share your screen again and go to the
Yep.
next slide. I think that's on the next slide.
I've got it here. I think I'll just copy it before I.
Oh, and Ben, for your TaxSlayer account, your Practice Lab account, you will probably need to change the site ID to the site ID that Rachel's putting in the chat. And I think she's going to put up on the screen too. Yeah, and so I'm reading the chat, and I just want to say, wow, Frank, you have a good memory. I want to remember.
Yeah, numbers are good.
This is Mike.
So, folks have any other questions? Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I got I got through to the practice lab,
Mhm.
and to get started, I think I pushed that button, and now I'm to the point where it's asking, do I want to start a new tax return? I don't want to do that
Oh, okay. That
until
means we're logged in. You probably don't want to start a tax return right now, right?
I want to do some training, and I can't how to get to the training.
Oh, so the practice lab, you're not going to get to any training from the practice lab. You're going to use the practice lab in your training.
Right.
Right. So once you know you can log in, we're basically done for the evening.
Okay.
Right. 'Cause my goal was that you get to the resources that you need, and then we'll start training. And you can, if you want, you can use Link and Learn, which is an IRS product. It takes you through topic by topic on the tax return. You basically click through some slides that with a little bit of information on each slide, and eventually it will ask you like a question to make sure you're understanding what was on those slides. A lot of people find it pretty laborious, and tedious. But some people really love it. It depends on the way you learn. So if you like, you might want to try Link and Learn. If you like it, do it. Or you can use our sessions. Our first sessions is on Wednesday this week. We have 2 sessions in December and then another 2 sessions in January. And if you don't want to wait for the 2 sessions that are in January, I'm going to post the slides. I just have to clean them up a little bit for some things that I rearranged or things that changed. So you'll have access to those slides. Or you can start reading that great big Bible publication 4491. Or you were a volunteer last year, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a good feel for things already. So you probably, for all you guys who are returning, a good way to start is to look in that publication 4491 and look in the section that says what's new to see what changed. Not much changed this year. Like the amount of the standard deduction changed, and the amount of allowable income for a qualifying relative changed, but not a lot changed. And it'll outline that in that publication. That's a good way to get started. And then you might want to just go directly to the testing and use, like me, I think I would use publication 17, which is that like tax Bible that everybody uses for their tax returns. You could just, the things that you don't quite remember, you could look up in there.
Okay.
Okay. Or if you wanted, I mean, probably the fastest way to get an overview is to go through the slides I'm going to provide. But you could also start reading in that publication 4491.
And Joyce, I'll be sure to when you have the slides kind of ready to go, I will send out the schedule of the optional virtual trainings, and then any documents and links that Joyce has as well, and then information on where you can pick up the paper copies should you prefer to have those too. So one thing I like so much about Joyce's training plans is there's lots of different ways to learn information, and you can kind of figure out what works best for you. So
Yes, I can see there's a question here that says, being present for the virtual training is not required. We can use other resources. Yeah, you can train any way you want. I am probably biased, but I think it's easiest to use the stuff I've prepared because it's more direct, I think. But it's up to you. Maybe it'd be a good fit for you, and maybe something else would be a better fit for you. But even the virtual training we're going to have, we're going to have a live session because last year I had only videos and people requested a live session. So we're going to have live sessions, but we'll record them. So you'll have access to those. You just won't be able to ask questions if you're not in the live section. You won't be able to ask questions in real time. You can always email us, so you still can ask questions. You'll be able to watch those videos, or I'm also going to make just a voiceover PowerPoint that you can look at. So you don't have all the interruptions that might have happened in a live presentation. But there's also Link and Learn, which a lot of people like. Try it out and see if it works for you. If you are a person that learns by reading like I am, the way I learned this stuff at first really is just reading through that publication 4491, which covers the tax return topic by topic by topic. I mean, there's even other videos out on the web where people are doing VITA training. I mean, there's a lot of resources. Oh, and Mike said he assumes he's going to get the link to the Wednesday sessions and the times. Yeah, I don't think we have the team meeting set up yet, but Rachel and I will work on that tomorrow. Oh, she already said yes, absolutely.
all right.
Okay.
Well, we are coming up on 8 p.m. So we made it. Joyce, any last thoughts or questions from anyone else on the call?
Yeah, so any questions? The one thing I want to say again is, like, if we end this session and all of a sudden you have a question, make sure you just email vita@johnsoncountyiowa.gov so that we can answer your question.
Well, thank you all
know.
so much for your, go
Wait,
ahead, Joyce.
before Rachel thanks you. If you were an Iowa City Public Library volunteer last year, you could say how much you enjoyed it. Or not.
Lots of fun. Lots of mistakes. Thank you, Joyce, for correcting all of them.
Okay, Rachel, now I'm giving you the floor.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time tonight. And as always, Joyce, thank you for your knowledge and expertise. And we'll all be in touch very soon with all of the information you need in written form. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had a great time last year.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Am I able to get you to try and help me troubleshoot getting the practice lab configured to this site?
Yes. Let me, and, okay, we're the only two left. Let me
That's
get
wrong.
into practice lab myself.
Okay. Here is mine. I was able to zoom in.
Well, let me get into practice lab myself.
Okay.
Maybe there's nothing, I mean, I don't get to see what you are doing in practice lab, so maybe there's nothing, but let me look. First I have to log in. It's good to see you, Ben.
Good to see you too. How are you?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to this. It'll
I
be
am
fun to see
too.
how it works with university students again.
It should be fine. Hopefully not quite as chaotic as it was 2 years back.
I think it'll work well.
I do too.
Now let's see. Okay, so options. So my only option is log out.
I know.
Change language. Huh.
I mean, I see setting up site information. Do you think that could be it?
No. I mean, all this is telling you is some of those things are like designed for me to know how to set up a site.
Okay.
I think maybe there's nothing. Maybe just the first time you log in there, you get to tell it what your site is, and after that, it doesn't care.
Okay. So for
Yeah,
the
I don't.
practice, since you're going to be administering all the passwords and logins for the actual VITA site, for the practice lab, does it matter quite as much if I can get into it either way?
No, I don't think it matters at all because I don't know. They do ask for information about what you're connected with,
Yeah.
but they don't report it to me. And you're not required to use the practice lab anyway. I don't get a report that says Ben went into the practice lab.
Yeah.
So I think you're fine. I don't see any place. I don't see any place to change my information in here. So that's their loss. I'm going to go with that's their loss.
So just assume use the practice lab I'm using, and for the VITA site, I'll get my own thing later.
Yeah. Yeah. We might have to do something special. Oh no, you'll probably get a login that says your B Hochstetter.
Yeah, because I know the
It'll
login's
probably
still
say underscore ICPL because last year it probably said underscore something else, right? UCC.
it did 2 years back. I
Yeah.
don't know why, but the login I have right now doesn't have UCC.
Oh, the login for the software, the real software.
For the practice lab, and I know when I take it into the TaxSlayer Pro just general, it goes and says this account is not active or
Oh,
something
right,
like that.
because none of those accounts are active. Yeah,
Yeah.
so you'll get another login. It depends how, so that piece, it depends what the software remembers about you. So I'll
Okay.
try to set it up in the Iowa City Public Library site. And if
Okay.
it remembers you from somewhere else, I might have to change something in
Of
that
course.
login, but I'll let you know what it is. But just
Okay.
use this practice lab as it is right now.
All right. And then for the university students, I know I have been setting up a course.
Oh,
I'm assuming I don't need most of this.
what? I can't read most of this.
Oh.
Where is this? Is
Give
this
me a
on an
second.
iPhone?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I have been trying to make this as comprehensive as possible.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
guessing if
Oh,
they're
so you don't need a Dropbox because they'll
No.
give that to me.
yes.
Yeah. And what's the link standard of conduct test questions? What's that linking to?
That is hyperlinking to form 6744
Oh,
to the
okay. The
specific
right place in
place.
there. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hey, would you check and see if maybe ask Dave if he had, I could do this, but I will forget by tomorrow.
Yeah.
Check with Dave and see if he has a budget for printing that he could print some materials for students, because it would be
Absolutely.
helpful for them to have a printed copy of publication 4491.
Yes, it would be.
And we will probably at the site will have that publication 4012. I don't think they sent us enough for all the volunteers, so we're going to give them out when people are actually at the site, but they have access to the online version because you gave them the online version. Good for you. This looks good. You just can't tell them any answers.
I think it'd be best for me to have like office hours, 2 hours a week throughout the duration of the winter break, and just like if they want answers, I can throw them a bone. I mean, I'm already writing down answers for stuff for just going through the tests.
Yeah, but you want to really make sure that they do those tests on their own.
Yes, definitely. If they want an answer, I'll just say it's in 4012 in tab whatever, or help them navigate that form so that they can have the skill to go and use it if they need it on the site.
Yeah, and I think I would also, if they ask you a question, like reflect back to them. This question is about like the wage line on the tax return, or this question is about entering the W-2, or this question is about determining whether a person is a dependent, so that they know why you're sending them to a particular section in that 4012.
Absolutely.
And I'll tell you, so we'll have to coordinate because I want to make sure everybody's marking up the intake sheet and everybody is oh, now I lost my train of thought. I want to make sure everybody's marking up the intake sheet in the same way.
Yes.
So I'm going to produce a form of how to mark up the intake sheet. We have also some other forms that are related to forms that Lisa used, but not exactly the same that we use at the site. So I'll eventually get those to all the volunteers. And we have a session in January that's a week or two before the sites to open. We're going to go over a practice taxpayer, and I'll have 3 more that they can do in the software, and I'll provide the answers to them.
Yep.
I couldn't tell whether Dave was going to have extra practice taxpayers or not.
I mean, I can take all the taxpayers from the previous year and just tweak them because
well,
let me see.
I don't think you have to.
Okay.
I mean, maybe let's talk about it some more, because it might be that university students get more out of having more practice returns.
Yeah.
But I would want to make sure the solutions look, because in the solution, I give them also the worksheets and what those should look like.
Yeah.
Like I want to make sure that the intake form is marked up exactly like I would mark up the intake form.
I know how I like seeing it. And I mean, I figure that's most of the stuff we're going to figure out in person in the first 2 weeks of January.
Yeah.
Because we'll have 2 nights with people from 6 to 9.
Oh,
and
okay.
I'm guessing it'll be best to work on that with like pen and paper.
Yes.
As opposed to anything I can convey on here without printing out a form, marking it up, and taking a picture of it.
Yeah. So at this point, I just don't want them to get off to the wrong start by developing a habit about how they mark up that intake sheet. Like I want them to definitely write N if it doesn't apply over on the right-hand side
Yes.
and leave the area where there's check boxes uncluttered. Right? Because
Absolutely.
that way you can scan down there and you can say, oh, this return only should have 3 things on it: wages, student loan interest, and whatever else, right?
Yes.
So, okay. But good that you've got all these links.
Yes.
Oh, and the practice tax first. Yeah, so I might be,
These are from 23, so I know it's not going to be
yeah,
as
I would
good.
just make that invisible.
Well, no, this is from this is from winter 2023.
Oh, this isn't your current year.
No.
Oh, okay.
So they don't have any of that in here.
Yeah, so I made some new practice taxpayers. They might have the same, they might be very similar to those, but I'm not sure what
wonderful.
Lisa was using.
Okay.
But I'll have those.
Did Dave give you access to this?
No, I don't think I'm a student. You can. Well, I don't know if you can. Oh, yeah, I have a university ID. So if you go to people, you should be able to add me.
Yes, I can. Let's see. Add a person.
So
Your
I'm
email.
just joyce-berg@uiowa.edu.
Like that?
Yeah.
Wonderful. And
oh, maybe because you are not the owner, you can probably only make me a student, which is fine.
probably I'll give an email to Dave and have him add you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or you can add me as a student. He can always add me as something else. Whatever's easiest.
Okay. I mean, unless I can. No, I can't upgrade someone. Okay. I mean,
So
I'll
good.
do you like this for now. So if you have any notes.
Okay, so I can always look in. I'm going to write
Yes.
myself a note that I actually have access to that.
And I'll have Dave get you upgraded to being able to edit.
Oh, okay. I
So you can have
won't
the
do
practice.
much. I won't do much though.
Of course. No, I don't want you doing too much. I'm at the end of this myself. I don't want to be doing too much more.
Well, it's got all the resource links, which will be really helpful to people.
Yes. Are there any other resources you think I should include? Because I know prior year they included like the Johnson County codes or the tax brackets. It'd probably be good for me to get a thing of all the school district codes. Do
Oh
we need
yeah,
those still?
I'll have that too.
I remember there was a website last year that had all the Johnson County codes to look up if we needed.
Yeah. So I have oh gosh, I have a form that tells you some common school district codes, and then it gives you the link for where you can look them up.
Yeah.
And it's a state of Iowa site now, so it's accurate. They really want you to have the right code on there. The Iowa tax brackets changed, so it won't be the same as 2023.
No. And I mean, I can probably track down where they got this from,
Oh,
but
there.
I don't think I ever used this once, but it's probably good to include it.
I don't know. I might get rid of it.
Okay.
Because there's no.
It's not that useful for preparers.
I guess maybe you could say, oh, the Iowa tax rate's about 4%, but
Yeah.
let me look something up here.
Oh, of course.
At some point, it's going to be just one tax bracket, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
No.
There are 3.
Of course there are.
Only 3 tax brackets. There's 4.4, 4.8, 5.7, and I guess 0 because there's a range of income that's not taxed at all. Oh, no, there's not.
Oh boy.
Oh, well, the thing is, the Iowa return, well, you know this from last year, it got a lot easier because it's based on federal taxable income.
Yeah.
So Iowa used to have a really low standard deduction. It was like $2,000 or something, but now
Yeah,
it's
it
whatever
was.
the federal one is.
Huh.
So there is a range of income that you don't get taxed on, but these tables are written in terms of taxable income. So
Okay.
taxable income starts out being taxed right away. I mean,
Yeah.
you can, if you think that would be interesting for your students, you can recreate that, but there's really no reason for them to be
It's not
trained
a,
differently
yeah.
than the other volunteers.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's going to be fun. Are
It
you
is.
prepared to be prepared to be a reviewer? It's fast and furious. We I don't know if Dave told you, but we reviewed differently than Lisa did. So
Oh yeah.
like, yeah, so when you last year, I think when you did the site, people came in, you interviewed them, they left. The person prepared the tax return, and then the reviewers reviewed those at a completely different time, and then the
Yes.
taxpayer came back.
I got to be
Right.
one of those reviewers last year.
Okay. So what we do at our site,
It's similar to 2 years back.
yeah. So we prepare the tax return while the taxpayer is there, and we review the tax return while the taxpayer is there. And we want that to take maybe 2 hours for the taxpayer, so we got to work pretty fast.
Yes.
But you usually, to start, think in terms of having like a half an hour to review a return, but really it's more like 15 or 20 minutes.
Yes.
And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to review a lot of the student returns and have you guys review some of the other preparer returns.
Yes.
And our preparers, we've got all kinds of preparers. We have one preparer that worked for the IRS for 30 years, and he's been volunteering for VITA for 19 years. We've got another person that owned their own tax practice. And then we've got somebody who was an astronomer. I mean, so our preparers are all over the map in terms of tax knowledge. It's really fun.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's really fun. So I think this will be a good experience, and I think we'll, like all the new people, I'm going to have that work with in pairs, and if I can, I'll have them work with somebody that did tax returns last year, which will help too. So anyway, it's going to be exciting. I have no idea how it's going to work out, but I think we'll get done a lot of returns.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. So
I'll email. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm happy that you have that website all put together.
I am too. I'm going to email Dave in just a little bit. I'll be sure to have you in there as well. And then just have him ask him what the printing budget is to see if we can squeeze anything into this term while it's still going.
Oh,
and then
yeah,
next term as well.
Yeah, it would be really good for them to have a copy of that publication 4490, the test retest 6744.
Oh.
Yeah, everything else, you know, students are so used to using everything in electronic form. Everything else is easy.
I'm used to it in the booklet because I know the whole 255-page booklet.
You don't need to print that. When I printed it for myself, I just printed
just only the test portions.
Well, and I only printed the tests for basic, advanced, standards of conduct and the intake interview. I didn't print the international, I didn't print Puerto Rico or whatever else is in there.
Are you familiar with where we got the booklets in the prior 2 years?
From the IRS, didn't you?
I believe so. I believe Lisa would know better than I would.
Yeah, I don't think they're printing them anymore.
Oh, great. That's wonderful.
I think they were, because we didn't get any. I don't think we got any. I think they were electronic only this year. They're trying to do away with all the print stuff.
I liked the print stuff too.
I do too. It's way easier to take those certification tests with the print version.
Much easier, because then now I either have to have 2 screens or I have to do it split screen.
Yeah, yeah. But I think we have to print them, and it would be helpful if they could be printed by the university for the university students. But you don't have to print the whole thing.
No, just those 4 sections.
Yeah.
And then would it be best to try and get those into like I don't know how you staple those or put those together, but okay.
I'll tell you what I did with mine. I printed them double-sided, and I stapled together the ethics test part.
Yep.
And then I printed the intake interview part and stapled that together.
Yes.
And then I printed basic, and I tried to staple it together, but it was too fat for a staple. But maybe the thing has a great stapler, or it's possible you have thinner paper there.
Yeah.
And then
we'll
I did the same thing with advanced and stapled it together.
Of course. I'll send him an email. We'll see if we can't get that done by the end of the week so we can get to the students while they're hopefully still on campus.
Yeah, and then the one other thing I had forgotten to mention to Dave, but we did talk about when he and Christy and I met in the summer. One option that your volunteers have, if they want, if they could help with the non-resident tax returns, they could help with the international students and scholars.
Yes.
And that would actually be helpful to that program, because I don't have anybody to help in there. And that is not preparing any tax returns. That's just helping people, like by answering questions.
Yes.
I'll send email to Dave and ask him whether he still wants that option for students, because it's available. They could do both, but where I'm going with this is, if it is okay with him for some of them to volunteer for the students and international students and scholars, then we would need to pass to print the foreign student test too.
Okay.
Which is in that book, but I'll write myself a note to email Dave.
Perfect.
Okay.
And the email I should be sending the
Oops.
testing stuff to. I'm going to put that in instead of a submission box. What should that email be?
What email?
Oh,
Say
the
that
one
again?
to the, where is it?
Oh, to give me the volunteer agreements?
Yes.
That should go to VITA@johnsoncountyiowa.gov.
So
Yeah, so you're not going to have those drop boxes, right? They're just going to send, like, I think Lisa was asking for the certificate of completion. We're not going to do that at all.
yep.
Okay, but yeah, that's
Okay.
johnsoncountyiowa.gov, not .com.
.gov.
Yeah, but use that address, but you'll just have one assignment, and that is, well, I don't know how you're doing it. You probably have more assignments, but the assignment that's important to me is that they're going to email their volunteer agreement to me after they're done with their certifications.
Yes.
And that volunteer agreement it'll tell me like they passed intake and interview, they passed ethics, they passed basic, they passed advanced. And do please keep reminding them that they need to pass basic separate from advanced because they
Yes.
can, I'm pretty sure the software will let them shortcut.
Oh, great.
Right. And I can't, at least last year, you could take advanced without taking basic. And I didn't try that out this year because I wanted to take the basic test. So I don't know for sure whether it would let me go right to advanced. But they don't get as many questions to test their knowledge if they just do advanced.
I know.
So, Ben, on your end, you can ask them to put in a Dropbox for you their basic certificate. I just
Yeah.
don't need it.
Okay.
And that way, I mean, if you did that with a Dropbox requiring the basic certificate, they would definitely have to take the basic test.
Yes.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Oh, this sounds good.
All righty. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. We got a lot accomplished.
You have a wonderful night, and I'll see you tomorrow night.
Oh yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye. And you'll get to meet Kennedy, the other TA.
Okay,
Tomorrow night.
good. Great.
All righty.